Hello friends, welcome to Premier UPSC Ias. So today we are going to start with polity and I will be covering almost all parts of polity from Lakshmikant, but only the important points pertaining to examination will be covered, hopefully. So let's start. Historical evolution, legislations before the constitution, introduction. The British came to India in 1600 as traders under the East India Company, which had the exclusive right of trading in India under a charter granted by Queen Elizabeth I. In 1765, after the Treaty of Allahabad, the East India Company obtained the Diwani rights over revenue and civil justice of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. This led to its career as a territorial power. In 1858, after the Sepoy Mutiny, the British Crown assumed direct responsibility for the governance of India, and its rule continued until India was granted independence on August 15, 1947. These events had a great influence on our constitution and polity. They are explained here in chronological order. The company ruled from 1773 to 1858. The Crown ruled from 1858 to 1947. During the company rule, that is from 1773 to 1858, numerous acts were passed by the British Parliament to regulate the affairs, both commercial, revenue, and military, of East India Company in India. However, the Government of India Act 1935 under the Crown rule became the main source of our constitution. Regulating Act of 1773. This act is great constitutional importance as it was the first step taken by the British government to control and regulate the affairs of the East India Company in India. It recognized for the first time the political and administrative functions of the company, and it laid the foundations of central administration in India. Features of the Act of Regulating Act of 1773. It elevated the status of Governor of Bengal by designating him as the Governor General of Bengal. Lord Warren Hastings was appointed as the first Governor General of Bengal. It created an executive council of 4 members to assist him in the discharge of his duties and functions. It made the governors of Madras and Bombay presidencies as subordinates to the Governor General of Bengal. Hitherto, all the three presidencies were independent of one another. It provided for the establishment of Supreme Court at Calcutta 1774, consisting of one Chief Justice and 3 other judges. It prohibited the company's servants from engaging in any private trade or accepting presents or bribes from the natives. It strengthened the control of the British government over the company by mandating the Court of Directors, the governing body of the company, to report on the company's revenue, civil, and military affairs in India. Fifth India Act of 1784. In order to rectify the defects of the Regulating Act of 1773, the British Parliament passed an amending Act of 1781 and 1784. Fifth India Act was passed. It is also known as the Act of Settlement. The Act was significant for the following two reasons. The company's territories in India were for the first time called the British possessions in India, and the British government was given supreme control over the company's affairs and its administration in India. Features of the Act. It clearly distinguished between the political and commercial functions of the company. It allowed the Court of Directors to manage the commercial affairs, and it created a new body called Board of Control to manage the political affairs. Thus, it led to the establishment of a system of double government. It empowered the Board of Control to supervise and direct all operations of the military and civil government or revenues of the British possessions in India. Charter Act of 1833. This act was the final step towards centralization in British India. Features of the act. It made the Governor General of Bengal as the Governor General of India and vested in him all civil and military powers. Therefore, this act for the first time created the Government of India having authority over the entire territorial area possessed by the British in India. Lord William Bentinck was appointed as the first Governor General of India. It deprived the Governor of Bombay and Madras of their legislative powers and therefore leading to extreme centralization of powers. The Governor General of India was given exclusive legislative powers to govern the entire British India. The laws made under the previous acts were called as regulations, while laws made under this act were called acts. It ended all the commercial activities of the East India Company and it became a purely administrative body. This act attempted to introduce an open competitive system for selection of civil servants. However, this provision was negated after the severe opposition from the Court of Directors. Charter Act of 1853. This was the last among the series of charter acts passed by the British Parliament between 1773 and 1853. Features of the Act. 1. For the first time, it separated the legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council. Also, it provided for the addition of six new members called legislative councillors to the council. Therefore, it is established a separate Governor General's Legislative Council, which came to be known as the Indian or the Central Legislative Council. This legislative wing of the council functioned as a mini parliament, adopting the procedures similar to that of the British Parliament. For the first time, legislation was treated as a special function of the government, requiring special machinery and special process. 2. It introduced an open competition system of selection and recruitment of civil servants. The civil service was thus thrown open to the Indians also. The Macaulay Committee on the Indian Civil Service was appointed in 1854 according to this act. It extended the rule of in East India Company over Indian territories and allowed it to retain their possession on trust for the British Crown. For the first time, it introduced local representation in the Indian Central Legislative Council. Of the six new legislative members of the Governor General's Council, four members were appointed by the local provincial governments of Bombay, Madras, Bengal, and Agra. Government of India Act of 1858. This significant act was enacted after the revolt of 1857. The act is known as the Act for the Good Government of India. It abolished the rule of the East India Company and transferred the powers of government, revenues, and territories to the British Crown. Features of the Act. It provided that India, from now onwards, was to be governed by and in the name of Her Majesty. It led to the change of the designation of the Governor General of India to that of Viceroy of India. Viceroy was the direct representative of the British Crown in India, and Lord Canning became the first Viceroy of India. It abolished the system of double government by scrapping the Board of Control and Court of Directors. It created a new office, that is Secretary of State for India, vested with complete control and authority over Indian administration. The Secretary of State was a member of the British Cabinet and was ultimately responsible to the British Parliament. It established a 15-member Council of India to assist the Secretary of State for India, and this council was an advisory body with Secretary of State as the chairman. The provisions of the Act of 1858 were largely confined to the process of improving the administrative machinery by which the Indian government was to be supervised and controlled in England. It did not substantially alter the way the system of the government prevailed in India. Indian Councils Act of 1861, 1892, and 1909. After the revolt of 1857, the British government felt the need of seeking the cooperation association of Indians in administration of their country. With regard to this policy of association, three acts were enacted by the British Parliament in 1861, 1892, and 1909. Features of the Act of 1861, that is Indian Councils Act of 1861. It made a beginning for representative institutions by associating Indians in the process of making laws. It provided for the nomination of some Indians by Viceroy as non-official members of his expanded council. In 1862, Lord Canning, the then Viceroy, nominated three Indians to his legislative council, the Raja of Benares, the Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao. It restored the power of legislation to the Madras and Bombay presidencies and therefore reversed the centralizing tendency that started from the Regulating Act of 1773 and reached its climax under the Charter Act of 1833. This policy of legislative devolution till the grant of almost complete internal autonomy to the provinces in 1937. It also provided for the establishment of new legislative councils for Bengal, Northwestern Frontier Province, and Punjab in 1862, 1866, and 1897 respectively. It gave the power to the viceroy to issue ordinances without the concurrence of the legislative council during an emergency, and the life of such an ordinance promulgated was 6 months. Portfolio system was introduced by Lord Canning in 1859. Under this system, a member of the Viceroy's Council was made in charge of one or more departments of the government and was authorized to issue final orders on behalf of the Council on matters of his department. Features of the Act of Indian Councils Act of 1892. It increased the number of additional or non-official members in the central and provincial legislative councils, but maintained the official majority with Britishers. It increased the functions of legislative councils and gave them the power to discuss the budget and address questions to the executive. It provided for the nomination of some non-official members to the Central Legislative Council by the Viceroy, based on the recommendation of the Provincial Legislative Councils and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce, and provincial legislative councils by the governors on the recommendation of the municipalities, district boards, universities, trade associations, zamindars, and chambers. This act made a limited and indirect provision for the use of election in order to fill up some of the non-official seats both in the central and provincial legislative councils. However, the word election was not used in the act. The process was described as nomination made based on the recommendation of certain bodies. Features of the Act of 1909. This act is also known as Morley-Minto reforms. Lord Morley was the These Morley-Minto reforms increased the size of the legislative councils considerably, both central and provincial. The numbers was raised from 16 to 60 members in the Central Legislative Council. The number of members in the provincial legislative councils was not uniform. It retained the official majority in the Central Legislative Council but permitted the provincial legislative councils to have the non-official majority. It expanded the deliberative functions of the legislative councils at both levels. For example, members were allowed to move resolutions on the budget, ask supplementary questions, and so on. For the first time, it provided for the association of Indians with the executive councils of the viceroy and governors. Satyendranath Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the viceroy's executive council as the law member. It introduced a system of communal representation for Muslims based on the concept of separate electorates. Under this system, the Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voters. This particular act legalized communalism, and Lord Minto came to be renowned as the father of communal electorate. It also provided for the separate representation of the members of commerce, presidency, corporations, universities, and zamindars. Government of India Act of 1919. For the first time on August 20, 1917, the British government declared that their objective was the gradual introduction of responsible government in India. Hence, the Government of India Act of 1919 was enacted and it came into force in 1921. This act is also called as Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Montagu was the Secretary of State for India and Lord Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India. Features of the Acts. 1. It diluted the central control over the provinces by demarcating and separating the central and provincial subjects. Therefore, the central and provincial legislatures were authorized to make laws on their respective list of subjects. However, the structure of the government continued to be unitary and centralized. 2. It also divided the provincial subjects into two parts: transferred subjects and reserved subjects. The transferred subjects were to be administered by the governor with the aid of ministers who are responsible to the legislative council. The reserved subjects were to be administered by the governor of that province and his executive council without being responsible to the legislative council. This dual scheme of governance came to be known as diarchy, but this particular experiment was largely unsuccessful. For the first time, it introduced bicameralism and direct elections in the country. Therefore, the bicameral legislature consisting of an upper house that is Council of State and a lower house that is Legislative Assembly replaced the Indian Legislative Council. The majority of the members of both the houses were selected through the direct election. It required that the three of the six members of the Viceroy's Executive Council, except the Commander in Chief, were to be Indian. It extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for Indian Christians, Sikhs, Anglo Indians, and Europeans. The franchise was granted to a limited number of people on the basis of property, tax, or education. It led to the creation of a new office of the High Commissioner for India in London and transferred him some of the functions that were hitherto performed by the Secretary of State for India. It led to the establishment of a Public Service Commission, and hence a Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926 with the purpose of recruiting the civil services. For the first time, it separated the provincial budgets from the central budget and authorized the provincial legislatures to enact their budgets. Its provisions led to the appointment of a statutory commission to inquire into and report on its working after 10 years of its enforcement. Simon Commission. The British government announced the appointment of a seven-member authority, seven-member statutory commission under the chairmanship of Sir John Simon to report on the condition of India under its new constitution. In November 1927, 2 years ahead of the schedule, all the parties boycotted the commission because all the members of the commission were British and there was no Indian representation. The commission submitted its report in 1930 and recommended the following: abolition of diarchy, extension of responsible government in the provinces, establishing the Federation of British India and princely states, continuation of the communal electorate, and so on. In order to consider the proposals of the commission, the British government convened three roundtable conferences of the representatives of the British India, Indian princely states, and the British government. Based on these discussions, a white paper on the constitutional reforms was prepared and submitted for the consideration of the Joint Select Committee of the British Parliament. The recommendations of this committee were incorporated with certain changes in the next Government of India Act of 1935. Government of India Act of 1935. This act was a second milestone towards a completely responsible government in India. It was a detailed and lengthy document having 321 sections and 10 schedules. This act came into effect in 1937 and was discontinued in 1939. Features of the act. It provided for the establishment of an All India Federation consisting of provinces and princely states as the units of the federation, but the federation never came into existence as the princely states did not join it. Government of India Act divided the powers among the center and units in terms of three lists: federal list for center with 59 items, provincial list for provinces with 54 items, and a concurrent list for both with 36 items, and the residuary powers were given to the viceroy. It abolished diarchy in the provinces and introduced provincial autonomy. As per the concept of provincial autonomy, the provinces were allowed to act as autonomous units of administration in their defined spheres. Moreover, the act led to the introduction of the responsible governments in provinces, that is, the governor was required to act according to the advice of ministers responsible to the provincial legislature. It provided for the adoption of diarchy at the center, and therefore the federal subjects were divided into reserved subjects and transferred subjects. However, this particular provincial of the act was not operationalized at all. It introduced bicameralism in 6 out of the 11 provinces. That is, thus the legislatures of the Bengal, Bihar, Bombay, Madras, Assam, and United Provinces were made bicameral, consisting of a legislative council upper house and a legislative assembly lower house. It further extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for women, depressed classes, scheduled castes, and labor workers. It abolished the Council of India, which was established by the Government of India Act of 1858. The Secretary of State for India was now provided with a team of advisors. It extended the franchise, and about 10% of the total population of India got the right to vote. It provided for the establishment of a Reserve Bank of India in order to control the currency and credit of the country. It provided for the establishment of both the Federal Public Service Commission, a Provincial Public Service Commission, and a Joint Public Service Commission for two or more provinces. The Federal Court established in 1937 as per the Act. Indian Independence Act of 1947. On 28th February 1947, Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, declared that the British rule in India would end by June 30, 1948, after which the power would be transferred to responsible Indian hands. Following which there was a widespread agitation by the Muslim League demanding partition of the country. Again, on June 3, 1947, the British government reiterated that any constitution framed by the Constituent Assembly of India formed in 1946 cannot be applied to those parts of the country which were unwilling to accept it. On the same day, June 3, 1947, Lord Mountbatten proposed the partition plan known as the Mountbatten Plan. This plan was accepted by both Congress and the Muslim League. Indian Independence Act 1947 gave the immediate effect to the plan. Features of the Act. It led to the end of the British rule in India, and India was declared as an independent and sovereign state from August 15, 1947. It provided for the partition of India and creation of two independent dominions. It abolished the office of the Viceroy and provided a Governor General for each dominion. Constituent assemblies of the two dominions were empowered to frame and adopt any constitution. Constituent assemblies of both the dominions were empowered to frame laws for their respective territories till the new constitutions were drafted and enforced. No act of the British Parliament passed after August 15, 1947 would extend to either of the new dominions unless it was extended by a law of the legislature of the dominion. It abolished the office of the Secretary for State for India, and his functions were transferred to the Secretary of State for Commonwealth Affairs. It proclaimed the end of the British paramountcy over the Indian princely states and treaty relations with tribal areas from August 15, 1947. It also granted freedom to the princely states of India either to join the Dominion of India or Dominion of Pakistan or to remain independent. It provided for the governance of each of the dominions and the provinces according to the Government of India Act of 1935 until the new constitutions were framed and the dominions were, however, authorized to make the modifications to the Act. It provided for the governance of each of the dominions and the provinces according to the Government of India Act of 1935, until the new constitutions were framed and the dominions were, however, authorized to make modifications to the Act. It deprived the British monarch of his right to veto bills or ask for the reserving certain bills for his approval. But this right has given to the Governor General, and he would have full power to assent to any bill in the name of His Majesty. It designated the Governor General of India and the provincial governors as constitutional or nominal heads of the states. They were bound to act on the advice of the respective Council of Ministers in all matters. It dropped the title of Emperor of India from the list of royal titles of the King of England. It discontinued the appointment to civil services and reservation of posts by the Secretary of State for India. The members of the civil services appointed before August 15, 1947 would continue to enjoy all benefits that they were entitled to till that time. At the stroke of midnight on 14-15 August 1947, The British rule ended and power was transferred to the two new independent dominions of India and Pakistan. Lord Mountbatten became the first Governor General of the new Dominion of India. Mountbatten swore in Jawaharlal Nehru as the first Prime Minister of independent India. The Constituent Assembly of India that was formed in 1946 now became the Parliament of the Indian Dominion. The Constituent Assembly of India. Constituent Assembly. In 1934, the idea of the Constituent Assembly for India was put forward for the first time by M. N. Roy, a pioneer of the communist movement in India. In 1935, for the first time, the Indian National Congress officially demanded a Constituent Assembly to frame the Constitution of India. Jawaharlal Nehru in 1938 declared the Constitution of Free India must be framed without any external interference by a Constituent Assembly elected on the basis of the adult franchise. The demand was finally accepted in principle by the British government in the Proposals of August Offer of 1940. In 1942, Sir Stafford Cripps came to India with a draft proposal of the British government with regard to the process of framing of an independent constitution to be adopted after World War II. The Cripps proposals were rejected by the Muslim League, which wanted the division of India into two autonomous states with two separate constituent assemblies. Finally, a cabinet mission was sent to India. While it rejected the proposal of two constituent assemblies, it put forward a scheme for the Constituent Assembly which more or less satisfied the demands of the Muslim League. Composition of the Assembly. The Constituent Assembly was constituted in November 1946 as per the scheme formulated by the Cabinet Mission Plan. The features of the scheme. 1. 389 was the total strength of the Constituent Assembly. Out of 389, 296 seats were to be allotted to the British India and 93 seats to be princely states. Out of 296 states that were allotted to the British India, 292 members were to be drawn from the 11 governors provinces and 4 from the 4 chief commissioners provinces, 1 from each. Each princely state or group of states in case of small states or province were to be allotted seats in proportion to their respective population. On average, 1 seat was to be allotted to every million population. Number of seats allocated every British province were to be decided among the three principal communities, that is Sikhs, Muslims and general, all except Sikhs and Muslims, in proportion to their population. The representatives of each community were to be elected by the members of that community in the provincial legislative assembly, and voting was to be done by the method of proportional representation by means of a single transferable vote. The representatives of the princely states were to be nominated by the princes or heads of the princely states. It is clear that the Constituent Assembly was to be a partly elected and a partly nominated body. Moreover, the members were to be elected indirectly by the members of the provincial assemblies, who themselves were elected on the basis of a limited franchise. The assembly comprised representatives of all sections of Indian society: Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Parsis, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians, SCs, STs, including women of all these sections. The assembly included almost all important personalities of India at that period of time except Mahatma Gandhi and M.A. Jinnah. Working of the Assembly. The first meeting of the Constituent Assembly was held on 9th December 1946. The Muslim League boycotted the meeting and insisted on the creation of a separate state of Pakistan. Thus, the meeting was attended by only 211 members. The oldest member, Dr. Sachidanand Sinha, was elected as the temporary president of the Assembly following the French practice. Later on, December 11, 1946, Dr. Rajendra Prasad and H.C. Mukherjee were respectively elected as the President and Vice President of the Assembly respectively. Sir B.N. Rao was appointed as the Constitutional Advisor to the Constituent Assembly. Objectives Resolution. On December 30, 1946, Jawaharlal Nehru moved the historic Objectives Resolution in the Constituent Assembly. It laid down the fundamentals and philosophy of the constitutional structure. It read, "This Constituent Assembly declares its firm and solemn resolve to proclaim India as the independent sovereign republic and to draw up for her future governance a constitution wherein the territories that now comprise British India and the territories that now form the Indian states and such other parts of India as are outside India and the states as well as the other territories as well as are willing to be constituted into independent and sovereign India shall be a union of them all. And wherein the said territories, whether with their present boundaries or with such others as may be determined by the Constituent Assembly, and thereafter, according to the law of the Constitution, shall possess and retain the status of autonomous units together with residuary powers and exercise all powers and functions of government. And administration save and accept such powers and functions as are vested in or assigned to the union as or as are inherited or implied in the union or resulting therefrom, and wherein all power and the authority of sovereign independent India, its constituent parts and organs of government are derived from the people, wherein shall be guaranteed and secured to all the people of India justice, social, economic, and political equality of status, of opportunity, and before the law, freedom of thought, expression, belief, faith, worship, vocation, association, etc. Wherein adequate safeguards shall be provided for minorities, backward and tribal areas, and depressed and other backward classes, and whereby shall be maintained the integrity of the territory of the Republic and its sovereign rights on land, sea, and air according to justice and the law of civilized nations. And this ancient land attains its rightful and honored place in the world and makes its full and willing contribution to the promotion of world peace and the welfare of mankind. Other functions performed. In addition to the process of drafting of the Constitution and enacting of the ordinary laws, the Constituent Assembly also performed the following functions. It ratified India's membership of the Commonwealth in May 1949. It adopted the national flag on July 22, 1947. It adopted the national anthem in January 1950. It adopted the national song on January 24, 1950. It elected the Dr. Rajendra Prasad as the first president of India on January 24, 1950. In all, the Constituent Assembly had 11 sessions over 2 years, 11 months, and 18 days. The constitution makers had gone through the constitutions of about 60 countries, and the draft constitution was considered for 111 days, 114 days. Committees of the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly appointed a number of committees to deal with different tasks of the constitution making. Among these, 8 were major committees and the others were minor committees. Major committees were 1. Union Powers Committee, Jawaharlal Nehru; Union Constitution Committee, Jawaharlal Nehru; Provincial Constitution Committee, Sardar Patel; Drafting Committee, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar; Advisory Committee on Fundamental Rights, Minorities, and Tribal and Excluded Areas, Sardar Patel. This advisory committee had the following subcommittees: Fundamental Rights Subcommittee J.B. Kripalani, Minorities Subcommittee H.C. Mukherjee, Northeast Frontier Tribal Areas and Assam Excluded and Partially Excluded Areas Subcommittee Gopinath Bordoloi, Excluded and Partially Excluded Areas other than those in Assam Subcommittee A.V. Thakkar, Rules of Procedure Committee Dr. Rajendra Prasad, States Committee Committee for Negotiating with States Jawaharlal Nehru, Steering Committee Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Minor committees. Committee on the Functions of the Constituent Assembly G.V. Mavalankar, Order of Business Committee Dr. K.M. Munshi, House Committee Dr. B. Pattabi Sitaramaya, Ad hoc Committee on the National Flag Dr. Rajendra Prasad, Special Committee to examine the draft Constitution Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, Prudentials Committee Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, Finance and Staff Committee Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Drafting Committee. Among all the committees of the Constituent Assembly, the most important one was the Drafting Committee, which was set up on August 29, 1947. This committee was the one entrusted with the task of preparing a draft of the new constitution. It consisted of 7 members. They were the following: Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Chairman; N. Gopalaswamy Iyengar, Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, Dr. K.M. Munshi, Syed Muhammad Sadullah, N. Madhava Rao. He replaced B.L. Mitter, who resigned due to ill health. T. T. Krishnamachari. He replaced D. P. Khaitan, who died in 1948. After giving due consideration to the proposals of the various committees, the drafting committee prepared the first draft of the Constitution of India, which was published in February 1948. The people of India were given a period of 8 months to discuss and the draft and propose amendments. In the light of the public criticisms, comments, and suggestions, the drafting committee prepared a second draft, which was published in October 1948. Enactment of the Constitution. The Constitution was adopted on 26th of November 1949 with a preamble, 395 articles, and 8 schedules. The preamble was enacted after the entire Constitution was already enacted. Dr. P.R. Ambedkar is recognized as the father of the Constitution of India. The Constitution came into force on January 26, 1950. This day is referred to in the Constitution as the date of its commencement and celebrated as the Republic Day. January 26 was specifically chosen as the date of commencement of the Constitution because it was on this day in 1930 that Purna Swaraj Day was celebrated following the resolution of the Lahore session of December 1929 of the INC. Criticism of the Constituent Assembly. There are criticisms about the Constituent Assembly on various grounds. These are as follows. Not a representative body. The critics opined that the Constituent Assembly was not a representative body as its members were not directly elected by the people of India on the basis of universal adult franchise. Not a sovereign body. The critics argued that the Constituent Assembly was not a sovereign body as it was created by the proposals of the British government. Further, they said that the Assembly held its sessions with the permission of the British government, therefore doubting the sovereignty of the body. Time consuming. As per the critics, the Constituent Assembly took an unduly long time to prepare the draft of the Constitution. They stated that the American Constitution was framed only in 4 months. Dominated by the Congress, the British constitutional expert Granville Austin remarked that the Constituent Assembly was a one-party body in an essentially one-party country. Domination of lawyers and politicians. Critics also state that the Constituent Assembly was dominated by lawyers and politicians as a result of which other sections of the society were not sufficiently represented. According to them, this is the main reason for the bulkiness and complicated language of the Constitution. Dominated by the Hindus. Lord Viscount Simon called it a body of Hindus, and even British PM Winston Churchill commented that the Constituent Assembly represented only one major community in India. Silent features of the Indian Constitution. Silent features. A number of original features of the Constitution, which was adopted in 1949, have undergone a substantial change on account of several amendments, particularly 7th, 42nd, 44th, 73rd, and 74th Amendments. The 42nd Amendment Act 1976 is known as Mini Constitution due to the important and large number of changes made by it in various parts of the Constitution. The Supreme Court in the Kesavananda Bharati case 1973 ruled that the constituent power of the Parliament under Article 368 does not enable it to alter the basic structure of the Constitution. The salient features of the Constitution as it stands today are as follows. Lengthiest written Constitution drawn from various sources, blend of rigidity and flexibility, federal system with unitary bias, parliamentary form of government, synthesis of parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy, integrated and independent judiciary, fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, fundamental duties, a secular state, universal adult franchise, single citizenship, independent bodies, emergency provisions, three-tier government, cooperative societies. Elephantine size of the Indian Constitution. It is a very comprehensive, elaborate, and detailed document. Four factors have contributed to the elephantine size of our Constitution. They are geographical factors, historical factors, single constitution, dominance of legal luminaries, unique blend of rigidity and flexibility. Constitutions are also classified as rigid and flexible. A rigid constitution, for example, American Constitution, a flexible constitution, for example, the British Constitution. The Constitution of India is neither rigid nor it is flexible, but a synthesis of both. The following three procedures confirms its characters of a unique blend of rigidity and flexibility, such as amended by a special majority of the parliament, amended by a special majority of the parliament and with the ratification by half of the total states, amended by a simple majority of the parliament in the manner of the ordinary legislative processes. Federalism in the Indian Constitution. The Constitution of India established a federal system of government. It contains all the usual features of federation, namely, two government, division of powers, written constitution, supremacy of constitution, rigidity of constitution, independent judiciary, and bicameralism. However, the Indian constitution also contains a large number of unitary or non-federal features, namely a strong center, single constitution, single citizenship, flexibility of constitution, integrated judiciary, appointment of state governor by the center, all India services, emergency provisions, and so on. Moreover, the term federation has nowhere been used in the constitution. Article 1, on the other hand, describes India as a union of states. This implies that the following two things. One, Indian federation is not the result of an agreement by the states, and two, no state has a right to secede from the federation. Hence, the Indian constitution has been variously described as follows. By K.C. Weir, federal in form but unitary in spirit and quasi-federal. By Maurice Jones, bargaining federalism. By Granville Austin, cooperative federalism. By Ivor Jennings, federation with a centralizing tendency. Parliamentary form of government. The Constitution of India has opted for the British parliamentary system of government rather than American presidential system of government. The parliamentary system is based on the principle of cooperation and coordination between the legislative and the executive organs, while the presidential system is based on the doctrine of separation of powers between the two organs. In a parliamentary system, whether in India or Britain, the role of the Prime Minister has become so significant and crucial that the political scientists like to call it a prime ministerial government. The parliamentary system is also known as the Westminster model of government, responsible government, and the cabinet government. The constitution establishes the parliamentary system not only at the center but also in the states. Even though the Indian parliamentary system is largely based on the British pattern, there are some fundamental differences between the two. For example, the Indian parliament is not a sovereign body like the British parliament. Further, the Indian state has an elected head republic while the British state has a hereditary head that is monarchy. Features of the parliamentary government of India. The features of the parliamentary government in India are the following: presence of nominal and real executives, majority party rule, collective responsibility of the executive to the legislature, membership of the ministers in the legislature, leadership of the prime minister or the chief minister, dissolution of the lower house, Lok Sabha or assembly, etc. Synthesis of parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy. The doctrine of sovereignty of the parliament is associated with the British parliament, while the principle of judicial supremacy is associated with the American Supreme Court. Just as the Indian parliamentary system differs from the British system, the scope of judicial review power of the Supreme Court in India is narrower than that what exists in the US. This is because the American Constitution provides for a due process of law against that of the procedure established by law, while the Indian Constitution embodied the procedure established by law, that is Article 21. The Supreme Court, on the one hand, can declare the parliamentary laws as unconstitutional through its power of judicial review. The Parliament, on the other hand, can amend the major portion of the Constitution through its constituent power. Integrated and independent judicial system. In India, a single system of courts enforces both the central laws as well as the state laws. In the USA, where the federal laws are enforced by the federal judiciary and the state laws are enforced by the state judiciary. Hence, the Supreme Court stands at the top of the integrated judicial system in the country. Below it, there are high courts at the state level, Under a high court, there is a hierarchy of subordinate courts, that is, district courts and other lower courts. A novel feature, DPSP. According to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the directive principles of the state policy is a novel feature of the Indian Constitution. The directive principles are meant for promoting the ideal of social and economic democracy. They seek to establish a welfare state in India. In the Minerva Mills case 1980, the Supreme Court held that the Indian Constitution is founded on the bedrock of the balance between fundamental rights and directive principles. Complementary feature of the fundamental rights. The fundamental rights are meant for promoting the idea of political democracy. They operate as limitations on the tyranny of the executive and arbitrary laws of the legislature. Hence, they are function for the citizen satisfaction, well-being, and overall development. On the opposite side, the fundamental duties serves as a reminder to citizens only. The fundamental duties explain to them that while enjoying their rights, they have also to be quite conscious of duties they owe to their country, their society, and to their fellow citizens. However, like the directive principles, the duties are also non-justiciable in nature. Secularism in the Indian Constitution. The Constitution of India stands for a secular state, hence, it does not uphold any particular religion as the official religion of the Indian state. The following provisions of the Constitution reveal the secular character of the Indian state. The term secular was added to the preamble of Indian Constitution by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1976. The preamble secures to all citizens of India liberty of belief, faith, and worship. The state shall not deny to any person equality before the law or equal protection of the laws, Article 14. The state shall not discriminate against any citizens on the ground of religion, Article 15. Equality of opportunity for all citizens in matters of public employment, Article 16. All persons are equally entitled to freedom of conscience and the right to freely profess, practice, and propagate any religion, Article 25. Every religious domination or any of its sections shall have the right to manage its religious affairs, Article 26. No person shall be compelled to pay any taxes for the promotion of a particular religion, Article 27. No religious instruction shall be provided in any educational institution maintained by the state, Article 28. Any section of the citizens shall have the right to conserve its distinct language, script, or culture, Article 29. All minorities shall have the right to establish and administer educational institutions of their choice, Article 30. The state shall endeavor to secure for all citizens a uniform civil code, Article 44. How is Indian concept different from the Western concept of secularism? The Western concept of secularism connotes a complete separation between the religion, the church, and the state, the politics. This negative concept of secularism is inapplicable in the Indian situation where the society is multi-religious. Hence, the Indian constitution embodies the positive concept of secularism. It dictates to give equal respect to all religions or protecting all religions equally. For example, the government facilitates the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra for Hindus and similarly facilitate Hajj Yatra for Muslims in form of Hajj subsidy. Moreover, the constitution has also abolished the old system of communal representation, that is, reservation of seats in the legislatures on the basis of religion. However, it provides for the temporary reservation of seats for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes to ensure the adequate representation to them. Citizenship in India and USA. In countries like USA, each person is only a citizen of the USA, but also a citizen of not only a citizen of the USA, but also a citizen of the particular state to which he belongs. Thus, he owes allegiance to both and enjoys dual sets of rights, one conferred by the national government, another by the state governments. But in India, all citizens, irrespective of the state in which they are born or reside, enjoy the same political and civil rights of the citizenship all over the country, and no discrimination is made between them. It is true for all excepting in few cases like tribal areas, Jammu and Kashmir, and so on. Importance of the emergency provisions. The Indian Constitution contains elaborate emergency provisions, Article 352, 360, and 365, to enable the president to meet any extraordinary situation effectively. The rationality behind the incorporation of these provisions follows, such as to safeguard the sovereignty, unity, integrity, and security of the country, and to protect the democratic political system and the constitution. During an emergency, the central government becomes all powerful and the states go into the total control of the center. It converts the federal structure into a unitary one without a formal amendment of the constitution. This kind of transformation of the political system from federal during the normal times to unitary during an emergency is a unique feature of the Indian constitution. Inclusion of three-tier government and cooperative societies. Originally, the Indian constitution, like any other federal constitution, provided for a dual polity and contained the provisions with regard to the organization and powers of the center and the states. Later, the 73rd and the 74th Constituent Amendment Acts 1992 have added a third tier of government, that is local government, which is not found in any other constitution of the world. Further, the 97th Constitutional Amendment Act of 2011 gave a constitutional status and protection to cooperative societies. It ensures that the cooperative societies in the country function in a democratic, professional, autonomous, and economically sound manner. It empowers the parliament in respect of multi-state cooperative societies and the state legislatures in respect of other cooperative societies to make the appropriate law. Why is universal adult franchise? The makers of the constitution described the following factors to propound the universal adult franchise in Indian democracy. As the universal adult franchise is a necessary condition to make democracy broad-based, to enhance the self-respect and prestige of the common people, to uphold the principles of equality, to enable minorities to protect their interests, and to open up new hopes and vistas for weaker sections. Other important points are Indian constitution are classified into written like the American constitution or unwritten like the British constitution. The Constitution of India has borrowed most of its provisions from the constitutions of various other countries as well as from the Government of India Act of 1935. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar proudly acclaimed that the Constitution of India has been framed after ransacking all the known constitutions of the world. Independent bodies are envisaged by the Constitution as the bulwarks of the democratic system of the Government of India, such as Election Commission, CAG, UPSC, etc. Sources of Indian Constitution. Government of India Act of 1935, Federal Scheme, Office of Governor, Judiciary, Public Service Commissions, Emergency Provisions, and Administrative Details. British Constitution, Parliamentary Government, Rule of Law, Legislative Procedure, Single Citizenship, Cabinet System, Prerogative Writs, Parliamentary Privileges, and Bicameralism. American Constitution, fundamental rights, independence of judiciary, judicial review, impeachment of the president, removal of Supreme Court and High Court judges, and post of the vice presidents. Canadian Constitution, federation with a strong center, vesting of residuary powers in the center, appointment of state governors by the center, and advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Irish Constitution, directive principles of state policy, nomination of members to Rajya Sabha, and method of election of presidents. Australian Constitution, concurrent list, freedom of trade, commerce, and intercourse, and joint sitting of the two houses of the parliament. Weimar Constitution of Germany, suspension of the fundamental rights during emergency. Soviet or Russian Constitution, fundamental duties and the ideal of justice, social, economic, and political in the preamble. French Constitution, the idea of republic and the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity in the preamble. South African Constitution, Constitution procedure for amendment of the constitution and the election of the members of Rajya Sabha. Japanese Constitution, procedure established by law. Criticism of the Indian Constitution. A borrowed constitution, un-Indian and un-Gandhian constitution, the elephantine size and complexity are the important criticism which are important for writing mains exam, hardly expected in prelims.